And that'll be it for Yankee Doodle, and I promise not to sing the song for you this morning. This is Kathy Palmer coming to you from WCPC, Channel 15, Westfield Community Programming. It is Tuesday morning. We're in a time warp again, and I have some great guests here today because this is the day that we talk about history happens, and history happens everywhere. History happens in Westfield, Massachusetts, and that is usually our topic. Today we're going to get a little more off of Westfield, although some of it is Westfield, but some is not. And I'd like to introduce my guests, starting from the end of the table. These are two faces that you know. You've seen on our show before, and we also like to have them as much as we possibly can. We have our fellow Westfield Historical Commissioners with us, Dr. Nicholas Ayeda. Dr. Ayeda is the head chair of the Department of History and Philosophy at Westfield State University. Notice I'm not saying Westfield State anymore, Nick. I'm good at that. At least I'm not saying State Teachers College. Yeah. And then that we have another friend of ours from the commission and one of our new commissioners, and we welcome him. He is the Energizer Bunny of the group, and that is Sam McMunn. Sam is also a well-known reenactor in the area. He goes far and wide with his gigs, and he stays out and sleeps in this kind of weather, folks. So when you're complaining that you're not warm enough in your bed, please think of him up at Ticonderoga laying on a bed of straw. So without talking anymore, we do want to get into the invasion of Quebec, the first invasion that would be. Not any current one, please don't have a fit. The first invasion in 1775, it may not be the first. And I know five, I did say six, didn't I? Five.
It's a fair question that you're asking.
But before that, we want to just touch a little bit on a great event this past weekend. As you know, this is about the time, well, maybe you don't know, but we'll tell you a little bit about it. I'm not going to. I'm going to let these gentlemen tell you about the Henry Knox Noble Train of Artillery, which came from Ticonderoga to Dorchester to end the siege of Boston that was happening in 17...
Well, I mean, the siege starts in 75 and then wraps up in 76.
Yep.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. There was an event at there's been many events, and they've all been fabulous. We heard great things about the event in Blandford, so I want to give a shout out to those people up there. There was also, I believe, Monterey has something this following weekend.
Yep, Monterey does.
They had an opening of an exhibit, right? I think the same
the Bidwell House.
Friday.
Yeah,
Saturday.
The Bidwell House. Yes.
Yep. And yeah, so go on their website and see what they have up. There's also a lot of pictures on the West Springfield site of the event that was last Saturday, and that was
it's me.
Oh dear, yes, there you go.
It is Sam.
And that was at the Springfield Armory, which is a National Historic Site. They did a wonderful job showcasing 6 different cities that were involved in this, mostly the River Valley section, that once they hit through the Berkshires, it involved Westfield, West Springfield, Sudbury, Warren. I'm missing one.
Yeah, I mean, Sudbury was there because they were represented by the Fife and Drum Corps, Warren, and then Wilbraham.
Wilbraham, that was the one I missed.
And that's Wilbraham's leader right there in that photograph that we see on the screen.
And he was also Henry Knox.
Yep, he portrayed Henry Knox.
He's aged very well.
Yeah,
he really
quite
has. Well. So I'm going to turn this over to our guest here to give you a little bit of background of the Knox train. Nick, if you'd like to start.
Sure.
And then we can let Sam add anything you know.
And I'll start a little bit with linking to what we just experienced this past weekend, and then I thought, Sam, if you don't mind, you can talk a little bit about the Ticonderoga side of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have much more experience on that end than I do. And we, at first, the event was really encouraging, I think, to see a lot of people having a great deal of interest in history, but also in the event itself. I was speaking with several of the park rangers about how, it's really heartwarming to see that many people present. It's the single most crowded event I've ever seen at the Armory, by far. And I couldn't be there in September because I had another obligation, but it just felt like a lot of good energy in these last several months.
I think my friend Jared was saying there, who was one of the rangers there. He was saying there was well over 500 people throughout the day.
Oh, easily.
Very, very well attended.
Yeah.
And before we get any further, I would like to give a shout out to Kelly Fellner, who put this all together. She is, I believe, director of the Armory.
Superintendent.
Of the Armory, and she did a fabulous job. So thank you.
And the event was, meant to obviously enlighten people, make people interested in the history of the movement of the artillery, and the other events that were taking place. So there was one in Great Barrington. We already mentioned Monterey and Blandford, and so forth. These are all along the pathway to the Connecticut River and just beyond. And what we're going to see in the next month or so is a continuation of these events at multiple other locations as they wind their way closer and closer to Boston. Just one other note. Brandon was very gracious and let us borrow these images, and he points out a couple of things. One, he said it was the first time in forever that he'd used this much manual focus for a lot of his images, which I can understand given the fact that we had a very nice appropriate amount of snow coming down, and Brandon is also on the Historical Commission in West Springfield. So Professor Allison, who was kind of our MC for a portion of the event on Saturday, Professor Allison from Suffolk University, and also on the board of the Rev 250 for Massachusetts, he pointed out to me that although Mayor Will was disappointed that he didn't have his own historian like Kathy did for Westfield. He did have a very good and skilled photographer, and I think the images that he captured were pretty remarkable.
They were excellent.
So I do encourage people to go and take a look. And he has, just as an aside, he has other interesting images.
I have a quick question. How representative was Saturday to the conditions they had moving those cannons?
Well, it's a good question.
With the snow and cold and stuff like that?
By the time they got to Springfield, the snow was beginning to taper off, and that actually created a challenge because one of the issues here is that if you're moving these items, yes, you can shift over to wheeled carts to pull them and so on, but the plan had been to not do that until they were closer to Boston, so not until the Framingham area. And so one of the challenges going east from Springfield, to Peter's question, is that there wasn't quite the same significant amount of snow. So then the sledges you designed and all the other stuff isn't really playing a role. Certainly coming over from the Berkshires, there's plenty of reports. Unfortunately, he stops keeping his journal too.
Yeah, it starts getting really complicated around that area. He starts running into a lot of troubles, a lot of problems. So he definitely just cuts off on the journal. It's just like, okay, I need to focus. Where you see a continuation of the journal is from one of the Teamsters, Solomon Nash, who starts recording in his journal about what's going on. He writes from January 1st of 1776 all the way up until January 1st of 1777. So we see a large continuation of not only Knox, but then the formation of Knox's artillery company, and then a continuation of different artillery companies throughout the newly formed Continental Army. So,
just a little bit of a background, though, because we do have listeners that may not even be aware of who Henry Knox was. So if you can just give us a brief of who he was and what he was trying to do.
Yeah, so by the time 1775 comes around, he's been in the militia for roughly 7 years, and he was training from about the time of 18. His younger brother is 19 in 1775 and is also working with him. Knox was, and his brother grew up in Boston. He was, his mother was alive, but his father had died earlier, and so at a young age he starts to work. As was not uncommon for a lot of people, obviously, in the time frame, and he's supporting his mother as well as other siblings and so on. By the time he's in his late teens and early 20s, he's operating as a bookseller in Boston. He's also fallen in love with Lucy, who will become his wife. Lucy's family is quite loyal to the crown, so that creates some tension between the family. Certainly her family was not interested in him marrying her, but he did so. And by the time you get to 1775 and the opening of hostilities between the regular soldiers and the militia, he is now moving out of the city of Boston because of that connection, and his training is coming to bear. Now, he not only did he read widely himself to teach himself about certain kinds of tactical utilities, basically, not only textbooks and other kinds of things on military maneuvers, but also construction of different kinds of firing platforms and protective barricades that one can build when you're utilizing artillery and that kind of thing. But he was also training in a unit that happened to be artillery. There's a whole other story about the Massachusetts Militia Artillery that doesn't play out in this year for 1775 and 1776. It also involves Paul Revere, and it's very bad because it results in Paul Revere's court-martialing. But we'll talk about that in a couple of years when we get to the 250th anniversary of that one. But because he's got this training as well as this wide interest and this sort of voracious appetite for reading, he's somebody who can. And he listens. This is another important thing. I think that he's listening to people who have experience. He did not. He's too young to have fought in the French and Indian conflict, of course, but he is listening to people who do have more experience. He's learning from other artillerists during the conflict leading up to the Breeds Hill battle in June of 1775. And so, although the colonial forces end up losing that battle in Charlestown and therefore lose control of Charlestown, they are in some respects still in a good position to control the British if, and this is the big if, and then we'll talk with Sam about Ticonderoga if they can do something about not only the British supply lines coming in via the harbor, of course, but keep the British penned into Boston. And, Boston was, and we saw this in Saturday's presentation, they emphasized this point in one of the images. Boston was a very difficult space to get in and out of. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The area that we're familiar with today, where Fenway Park is, for example, and the Museum of Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the back fens, that was all swamp and part of the Charles River.
I don't think people know that. I don't think they realize that it was just that little...
Back Bay did not exist.
Yeah. Right.
That's why they called it the Back Bay. I mean, it's filled in the early 1800s, and what they do is they kind of chop down parts of the hills that lead up to Beacon Hill in order to do the filling. Not an uncommon procedure in a lot of communities. The Mexica had done this in what we would call Mexico City now, long before Europeans arrived. But so it's like the idea of filling in, land. And using it as a protective space made sense. For the British, it became a prison in a sense. They couldn't really get out. The one way to get out that was easy, and I put that in quotations, would be to go down through what was called the Roxbury Gate, where literally there was a gate where modern-day Roxbury is. But the problem is the colonial military, and certainly once Washington takes command in the summer of 1775, they simply don't have the right kind of artillery to cut off the supplies that are coming in via the shipping lanes, and they can't quite threaten. They didn't necessarily want to bombard the city, but they wanted to be able to be in a position to make it clear to the British, you're not getting out of here, and we're going to start bombing your naval transport ships and your supply ships. But to do that, they need the cannon. So that's where Ticonderoga comes in. So Sam, take it away on that.
So in starting up to the lead up of exactly how we got to Ticonderoga. So two men, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, both with separate orders originally to capture Fort Ticonderoga, end up meeting by chance shortly after these orders had been given in 1775. They end up capturing the fort in the middle of the night. No shots were fired off, and no hostilities were had. Ethan Allen did want to kill every single person within the fort. He did issue orders to his militia to do so. However, Benedict Arnold said, no, we are not doing that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there were also a lot of, this was an invalid posting. So these were guys in some cases, not everybody. But
So it was run by the 26th Regiment of Foot
Right.
during that time under the command of Captain William Delaplace. And the British had only issued a total of 50 soldiers, not only to just guard Fort Ticonderoga, but to also guard Crown Point as well, which was about, I want to say like 10 miles to the north of Fort Ticonderoga. So you have 50 people, you can either split them half and half. So when you really look at it, you probably only had between 20 to 25 people at Fort Ticonderoga when the fort was captured, where on average to run that fort, you needed between 500 to 1,000 to run that fort in any type of capacity. Fort Ticonderoga was also extremely run down. After the capture of Fort Carillon during the French and Indian War, which is what Fort Ticonderoga was known as prior to being Fort Ticonderoga, the French, while abandoning the fort, had lit a fuse to the gunpowder stores, which were underneath the South Officers' Barracks. Within those barracks, there was well over 30,000 pounds of gunpowder. They ignited the fuse to that, and it pretty much, what the hope was is that it would cause a chain reaction. The walls were filled with gunpowder stores, so they were hoping by lighting the fuse to the largest store, it would cause a chain reaction and just blow up the whole fort. It did not. What ended up happening is it just blew that North Officers' Barracks sky high. And then after that, the fort all the way from 1770, pretty much all the way up until the end of the Revolutionary War, was always in some form of various disrepair. So not only do you have a poor force at Fort Ticonderoga, in addition, you have a dilapidated fort that is constantly crumbling around you and falling apart. So when Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold capture the fort, they send Captain William Delaplace's men away, and then they realize that they have this huge stockpile of cannons. Now, why do we need the cannons up here? We don't have a use for the cannons. There's no current war going on around Ticonderoga. So they start thinking about things to do with the cannons, and some of the thoughts, lead up to the siege of Quebec. And then eventually out in Boston, George Washington and Henry Knox meet, and they know that Fort Ticonderoga has been captured. They know that there's a lot of cannons up there. So then Henry Knox gets the orders to go to Ticonderoga, get the cannons, and bring them to Boston.
Yeah, and when he's given those orders in November of 1775, he knows that he's got to take an inventory, and then he's got to figure out what ones is he going to move. And ultimately, he chooses 59 to 60 pieces, essentially, that are going to be the best for their purpose.
Yeah.
And they head to, he and his brother head to Ticonderoga in a slightly easier way than the way they come back. So they're heading by ship to Manhattan, and then they're up the Hudson River. And once they've taken the inventory, he starts to plan out, this is how we're going to start to do this. And by late December, they're on their way. And the challenge, and this goes back to Peter's question, that one of the challenges was that even at the beginning part, there wasn't quite enough snow and cold for what they had hoped to be able to do, which was to get things across the river utilizing simply the frozen nature of the river itself, rather than having to get bateau and other kinds of vehicles to move them across water.
Yeah.
And, that crossing, once it starts to take place, is rife with some risk, certainly. You don't want to lose any of these items. But I think it's interesting that Knox, again, I would look at the fact that he listened and the fact that he read. So for people who are wondering, how do you learn how to do things you don't know? Well, there's no YouTube, obviously, in 1775. Right. So he's listening to what people have to say, and he's making assumptions about, well, if I do this, this will work. And some of it is simple engineering, and some of it's just really careful planning. So the idea of putting those buoyant barrels, to mark the cannon should they break through the ice, that's just a good plan.
He's getting a lot of these ideas about the sledges and stuff actually from the French. When the French were over here during the French and Indian War, obviously they also needed to get cannon to Fort Carillon at the time. So one of the writings that he finds is it talks about these sleds or sledges that they used to transport the cannon from Quebec to Fort Ticonderoga at the time. So he knows during the winter months that this can be done with certain apparatus that you need to do it. And so he's like, okay, if they did it from Quebec to Fort Carillon, we can do it, except Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. So
and I think the biggest challenge here is, I mean, the weather was a problem, obviously.
Absolutely.
But also the hills. So it's a slightly different kind. You were still passing over hills, to get down from Montreal and Quebec and so on. But if certain bodies of water freeze appropriately, you have a little less of a challenge, I would argue, to get down when the French are bringing those guns there. And so the other thing that they're thinking about is, all right, not only do we choose the pieces, we also need to bring some of the shot, and we need to figure out what other kinds of equipment do we need, to be able to have an effective series of implements to use for the siege in Boston. They they anticipate that it's going to take a while. Obviously, once they cross into Massachusetts, the weather cooperates in the sense that there's more snow, and then creates more challenges in the same vein, and that's making it easier. We heard, and it's referenced several times because he actually keeps notes on this, as do other people, that anytime they were crossing water, he was thinking about, well, how could we make sure that the ice is going to be thick enough? So there's different kinds of strategies that he uses there, and then. But then there's the practical challenge of, all right, we've got to get up the hill, down the hill, up the hill, down the hill repeatedly, essentially until you get into the flats, if you will, of general flats of Westfield to West Springfield to the Connecticut. And, that part of the equation is further challenged, I suppose, by a couple of times where the Teamsters, who are really doing a lot of this work, are sort of saying, yeah, we're done. We'd really rather not keep going, And
now,
so,
where were the Teamsters from?
So the initial group is from New York.
Okay.
And he, has them somewhat committed anyway, to get across the Connecticut River. But then different reports suggest that by about halfway through the Berkshire Hills, some of them are sort of thinking, I don't know if I really feel like going all the way to the Connecticut. And he's able to convince them. He does get some local folks as well to help them out, particularly on this last bit, this far eastern edge of the hills. And then once it's across the river in Springfield, then there we go. Now we're transitioning to Massachusetts teams fully. And that's how we have, unfortunately, we already mentioned this, right? But and you can understand why. You already said this, Sam. I'm a little tired. Maybe I'm not going to keep my journal. Maybe I'm not going to write the letter. Because we see a couple of communications to Washington, and then we have the journal to a point, but then that's kind of it. And then our big story connecting it to Westfield is really only recorded by a reminiscence. And that's, they're challenging in some respects, but and in this case, it was a New York Teamster. But he was all of 11 or 12 years old.
And I believe it wasn't written until around 1820
and
not published until 1850.
33 was the first edition.
33.
Then they published another one in 63 or 65 or something like that. And he and it was published by one of the newspapers in Albany, but then they published a book that basically is a reminiscence of the war. And so, okay, John Becker, who is the Teamster we're referring to, he's alive still, so that's positive. But he is also looking back at this from his late 60s, looking backwards
As an
to
11-year-old.
11 and 12-year-old boy.
And we get that a lot too.
Yeah.
You have some accounts of Bunker Hill or Lexington and Concord that are happening many years later, and they're saying, "Well, I think this is what happened, but I'm elderly and I can't really remember."
Don't make fun of the elderly.
I'm not making fun of you. I'm elderly and I can't really remember what happened when I was 18, 19. So
And they might have remembered snippets that were colored by their own experience.
Right.
We do know, well, we think we know, that they probably stayed at the Clap Tavern, and the Clap Tavern is still there. It was originally on the corner of Court Street and Elm, where the Boys and Girls Library is. The building was moved so that they could build that new house, the Fowler-Gillett House, that it still houses the Boys and Girls Library, as a matter of fact. The Clap Tavern is, I believe it's 53 Court Street. It is the second house down from City Hall. People in Westfield know it as Dr. Peppick's office, not the dentist, but the orthodontist. And it used to be Dr. Beatty's house.
Yeah, and it
So
was
that's how
moved,
we
you
would note it.
thought it was moved sometime around 1838?
Somewhere around there. Yeah, somewhere in the
So
the
perhaps
1800s.
within 5 to 8 years or so of one of the first publications of Becker's Reminiscence, the building itself has moved. So this is one of the other interesting things about history in this time period as well, is just that the spaces, the very physical spaces in which these events take place, are not always the same, as they were. And we understand that from a natural perspective, of course. We understand, erosion and all these other things. But the idea that communities in the 19th century would start moving houses around, that's sometimes foreign to 21st century people.
And they did it all the time.
But they did it all the time.
all
yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
Just jack it up, put it
Yeah.
on wheels, and roll it up the street.
Roll it up the street, exactly. And so that's probably what happened there. We do know, or as you pointed out, we think we know that, or are fairly certain that that's the tavern. We are equally fairly certain, probably more than a 90% certain, that they were not in the Sackett Tavern, which was down at the base of the hill that they come down through Blandford and Russell on. And another question that a lot of groups have been exploring, this didn't really come up in this past weekend's presentations here, but it has come up elsewhere, so in Monterey and at the Dublin Folk Seminar piece in June of 2025, is, well, where were they walking? And as we heard on Saturday, one of the few things that we know that they passed over is still standing, and that's this stone bridge in Wilbraham. That is kind of interesting because the rest of the route is, you could throw dandelion fluff into the wind and sort of get people to say, oh, yeah, definitely they passed by here.
Yeah. I was hearing a lot of people say, oh, well, the Boston Post Road, Route 20. And it's like, well, you have to think about this in a certain way, too. Why, if I'm secretly transporting restricted items that I should not have, aka cannon, why would I take a main road to get to where I'm going?
Yeah, I think they do for part of it.
They
it
do
seems,
for a very short portion.
But it's a good point. Like, do you automatically take the post, right out of Springfield? Well, maybe not. So that's a question mark. And then one of the things that we've seen people debating about and so on. You've got folks up in Otis, for example, and other communities who have, sort of tried to blaze trails in the woods and find we think this is maybe where, they might have been for part of it, but nobody's been able to really put together the whole of it because there wasn't a road. I mean, this is the other.
And as you said, things have changed. Yeah. I was asked a few years ago. There is a gentleman who has put together a probably fairly accurate map, and it's been sent on to Boston. He contacted me and asked me about a farm in Westfield with someone's name on it. And there's in somebody's journal, they mentioned, well, I remember when I went by my farm. And I contacted an archivist in Westfield. whatever farm this was and whoever it was, there's no record. It's just somebody that lived on the mountain somewhere, somehow. Maybe they went by.
Well, farmland was also marked by, the stone walls, and
please, don't
a
even
lot
go
of those
there.
stone walls are long gone.
Please, I live on a farm, and my deed says by the wall, by the tree, by the yard, by the rock. You and I have talked about this a
pretty
million
much.
times.
Near this oak tree.
So that's a problem, isn't it,
Yeah,
Nick? Because the names have changed, the farms have changed, the land has changed, the ownership has changed.
Another thing that I like to point out too, that I'm starting to debate with other reenactors, is the mention of, while in Westfield, they fired off a mortar. Now, here's the problem. They say that in the Becker reminisce, it says that the mortar was known as the Old Sow. However, when you look at Knox's journals, and then you look at the Continental Artillery Register, where if there was a named cannon, it would be in there, the Old Sow is listed as a 24-pounder cannon,
Right.
which means that it was not a mortar,
Yeah.
it was a cannon.
So which one?
So
So was it a mortar? Was it a cannon? Was it fired? Well,
I'm sure it
in
was
theory, something was fired.
I mean,
right? We
but-
feel comfortable with
But
that.
my question is do we have any records from people in Westfield,
Right.
journals, diaries, etc., that actually say from the people of Westfield, Knox fired off the cannon from us? Not just from Becker, not just from Knox, not just from any. Someone living in Westfield at the time who said in their journal, they fired the cannon.
The answer is not that I know of.
Exactly.
Dr. Brown was just with you a month ago in December, and one of the things Bob pointed out is, unfortunately, there's several problems here. One, the town records in the time period
They're
are gone.
Yeah.
The minister who
Valentine.
would have kept even a sentence record, and he wasn't great all the time, but at least he would have had a sentence.
Right.
He was no longer with us by the time they got to town. And probably even if he had been still alive, and it was very close, right? I think he dies like right before they get here.
I thought he.
Well, he stops being minister
in July or something.
Yeah, he stops being minister in 74, but he is not really actively writing anything down in 75 and 76. But I think he actually dies in early 76.
Well,
And then-
he joins the militia in 75 as well. And here,
Well, I think
here he
that's
is,
his-
this old man practically on his deathbed, joining the militia in 75. So I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be
I would have
surprised
to look
if
that up. I'm not sure.
I wouldn't be surprised if he was possibly out in Boston during that time assisting with the siege, considering that we had all gone out there.
I don't know that he was, but I don't know.
Right.
I mean, the other thing is that the next minister to take any kind of detailed notes, and even his are not real great, he doesn't get formally appointed until years later. So we've got this gap right here in this moment. And so 1776, including the visit to town, is bereft of detailed information.
And I'm surprised we don't hear anything from Faley. We don't hear anything from Shepard. We don't hear anything from Parks. We don't hear anything from any of them.
Or the Ashley family.
And by this time in 1776, when they're coming through, we know that Faley and Shepard and Parks have all returned from Boston. Faley had fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill and had returned shortly thereafter after receiving the orders from George Washington to start constructing the muskets. And this is what's surprising to me, is we don't hear anything from who we consider to be these big wigs of Westfield.
And I think one of the things that Bob also mentioned, though, is that Westfield itself, according to him, just wanted to be left alone.
Right.
It doesn't surprise me.
We didn't really want to get all that involved. He said that we wanted to go about our, and that may be some of the reason why they're just not paying attention to what's happening. I don't know that. I'm only repeating.
It's interesting that somebody like, that there aren't, a letter. We understand, okay, town records can disappear and certain people are not necessarily capable or interested in keeping their journal up at this point or what have you. But even that, some of these leading families don't have any kind of letter reference, from that visit is somewhat problematic. And then the other issue with the pathway, if we just think about the commemorating the pathway, is similar to this year. 1925-26 is part of the 150th anniversary of these events, and so communities were doing their work, and the state was doing its sort of tourism drive and so on. And so really the pathway where we see the markers and everything else, we're one of the few towns arguably that maybe has a marker close-ish, possibly, to where they might have passed, because the others were placed along major roads at this point. It's very similar to the project along Route 2. You're trying to build up tourism. There's increased automobile use and trafficking, and so you're trying to find these ways. And then, of course, it's also privately, sort of quasi-privately funded, and so it's no accident that one of the markers ends up in front of one of the funders' homes. Up there in Russell. So, it's not that surprising that, the pathway is there. And look, in the long run, when we're talking about these kinds of things, memorialization is different than history. And I think that's an important thing for people to keep in mind. And so having the exact route, okay, that's interesting to certain people for sure. But having the markers to indicate that this event took place, that's probably a little more vital, I would argue, in certain cases. And so here we are at the 250th, and we're in a different kind of commemoration than we were 50 years ago. And it's interesting to see where the events will take us. We know that we've got, obviously, our transition here across the Connecticut River, and that was celebrated on Saturday.
WCPC?
And sorry, I forgot the time. And we've got also our next transition is going to be as they get out of the sledges and get into the carts, and they start to head their way as they set everything up just outside of Boston and Framingham, and then make the decision about where they're going to place these cannon.
When did they actually get to Dorchester?
Well, they bring the cannon close to the city in early March of 1776, and then they make a decision about where they're going to place them, and they will do this under the cover of darkness on the 16th of March, it's earlier than that, in March. And once the guns are up there, then the new commander in Boston has kind of a decision to render here. Am I going to attempt to assault the hill, which ultimately they decide not to do? Or hills, I should say, really, because it's just a little series of them overlooking the city. And then what are we to do? Because with the cannon now trained on both the shipping lanes and the city itself, we have a serious problem on our hands, because even as long as the Long Wharf was, and it was quite lengthy, the Long Wharf was not long enough to be out of the range of some of these guns. And that was the concern. That was why Washington had sent Knox in the first place, was that the guns they did have just didn't have the range, really, to be able to reach into the harbor. And so the British are facing a serious kind of problem, and one that's repeated in other American cities from this time, 1776, going forward. And the issue here is, well, if I'm like Lucy Knox's family, her birth family, and I'm a loyalist, well, now what? Because everybody knows I'm a loyalist, and the troops are all going away. So what do I do?
Yeah.
And what people did is they start to fling themselves to different parts of the British Empire. So and that's covered in great detail in a wonderful book by Maya Jasanoff called Liberty's Exiles, that explores this concept. Like, what happens when liberty comes, but you're not part of the liberty?
Yeah.
And for the Knox family, it meant for Lucy eternal separation, on this mortal coil anyway, because she never saw that family again. And
they went where?
to Halifax initially. In terms of where her family went after that, I don't know if they stayed or not. Some families did. And in the case of in the southern colonies, you'll see people make a choice. They'll either go to Canada, to England, or down to the Caribbean, typically. And that was true also of people of African descent who were fighting alongside the British or serving the British. And as they are, in some cases, freed from enslavement, they are making conscious choices to go to certain places. So Halifax was one of them, but these other locations as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that was about the next. We spent a little bit more time than I.
Well, but
I understand.
It's a good transition because when he
time.
gets to the Boston area, it's sort of serendipitous, really. But he arrives, and at the same time, news comes from Canada. He's good news. The other,
Canada's bad news.
Not good.
And now we'll move on to before we move on to why Quebec. Now you say Quebec. Is that the correct way to say it?
Quebec. Yes.
What do you say?
Quebec or Quebec.
Up there.
Quebec is how the
Quebecois.
Canadians,
Canadians.
that's how they pronounce it.
Well, when I
Quebec.
was listening to some of our speakers Saturday, some of the cities, they were saying some of the cities at the other end. I thought, no. But anyway, I do want to give a shout out to is it 52 Sumner? Is that what I call it, Peter?
Yeah, 52 Sumner.
52 Sumner that produced the original musical yesterday for Life and Liberty. It was a wonderful time. They did an excellent job. Shout out to all of the people that were involved. And it was mostly more about his trip from Albany down to Springfield. So having said that, we're going to find out why. And the first question I have about Quebec is when we think about it today, we're not talking about that same territory. So what territory are we actually talking about back in 1776?
Well, the old city, which if people haven't been, it is really truly one of the most beautiful cities in North America.
Yeah.
It's a real lovely space. The British were able to capture it in 1759, which sort of ultimately led to the end of the French rule in the space. From 1760 until the Revolution, the British find different ways to, I'm going to say manage, but that's a polite term, or massacre, depending who you want to talk to, the various population that they're dealing with there. And in this case, just so people understand, a lot of this is driven by, it's not so much British-French rivalry as much as it's Protestant-Roman Catholic rivalry. And there's a great deal of not only removal, but also outright murder of my mother's family's ancestors in the Acadian territories to the east of Quebec.
Oh, that's right.
And it's really quite sort of shocking in some ways. And people who haven't read about it, there's a number of good books that explore this piece. But I think by the time we get to the Revolution, one of the weird things about the beginning years of this is that American colonists are saying to these now new British Americans, because we're all living in North America and we're all under British rule, they're now saying to these French Canadians whom they hated, I mean, let's just be blunt, they did not like these people, largely based on their religious disagreements. So, but yet by 1774 and 1775, they're thinking, well, we can get these folks on our side.
Yeah.
And they'll become the 14th colony, and they'll become part of our American story here in this space as we try to move ourselves from being British subjects to something else. So part of the reason for the invasion is the anticipation that we're going to be able to make new allies, not only among indigenous people, but also among the French citizenry, and we'll push them against the British. Not so much. I'll have Sam talk a little bit about the two-pronged assault here, because the idea was, and I'll just outline it briefly. The idea was to assail the city from two different sides. But given communication and technology at the time, this was going to be difficult. So Benedict Arnold, who we've already heard about from today, is part of the force that's going to move from down east, as we call it, Maine, right, in Massachusetts, up through Massachusetts to the Canadian border and through the Rangeley Lakes region and the Bigelow Mountain Range and so on. And he's gonna come from that side. And Richard Montgomery and others are going to come from the west side. And the attempt to move up is born out of ignorance, really. There's a great deal of ignorance about, well, how far up the Kennebec River you can get, how far up the Penobscot River you can get. Can you actually reach Canada? No, is the short answer. You have to walk quite a bit. They didn't quite have enough supplies, but two quick stories, and then I'll turn things over to Sam here. One, the American troops who go are, in many cases, they're being kind of sought as volunteers out of the local militia groups, and Arnold's men are among them. The idea is sanctioned by the American Congress, the Continental Congress as well. But the key thing here is we're not to destroy anything. We're not to steal things, or destroy things in the Canadian territory, because we're trying to make allies here. Unless, of course, we're talking about the British. So so that's one part of it. And then the second part is in a fascinating kind of, I don't really know how to explain this other than explaining it, but they take off from Newburyport on the North Shore, north of Boston. And Newburyport was the final resting place for a very famous religious leader, George Whitefield, who was Irish, but came to America on 7 separate visits. On his last visit, he died and was interred at Newburyport. He was somebody that people who went to hear him were mightily changed by the experience. Even Benjamin Franklin thought him to be one of the most compelling speakers he'd ever heard, and Franklin was a man who famously did not really believe in God and so on, and yet found himself kind of compelled by Whitefield's speeches and mannerisms and so on to be a supporter in certain ways. Anyway, Whitefield was seen as this great figure, and here we are a generation or so after, maybe half a generation or so after his death. And what do these soldiers do? These are Protestant Christian soldiers, I want to point out, and they're about to go invade a Catholic area. So what do? They go to Newburyport, and they are sort of venerating the resting place of Whitefield. They're taking a piece of him, almost like Catholic Crusaders would have done in the 12th and 13th and 14th century. And so there's a steep irony here that a group who is very much against sort of the sainting and all of this other stuff, they are going to take St. George, they don't call him that, but a piece of Whitefield with them and believe that he represents luck for this invasion.
Yeah.
He does not. It does not go
Apparently
well.
not.
So that force meets some serious privation and other problems.
Another thing I like to point out about Benedict's forces as well is he employs the use of Virginians.
Yes.
As well. Kind of one of the reasons why the Virginians end up joining is because by this time, Benedict has resigned from his commission. He's kind of ruined his own reputation. And by this time, the first time, the Massachusetts militia people don't like him.
Yeah.
The New York militias don't like him. None of the people commanding Fort Ticonderoga like him. So he's kind of like, well, I'm stuck. I need people who don't know me. So this is where he pulls in the Virginians to come up and be like, let's go. We will invade Canada. Nothing bad will happen to us. We will be fine. So that's like one of the things that I like to point out is it's this we don't like you that leads to bringing in other forces to be able to actually go and invade Canada.
And that trip is rife with all kinds of problems. We're talking about Dan Morgan's men, as you're alluding to here, who are arguably among the sort of best marksmen in the military at that point. They were, at least a portion of them were in place for part of the Breeds Hill conflict and so on, but mostly in the after sort of withdrawal period. But so then the other problem is we've got Montgomery, who's a former British officer, who, and this happened a couple of times, obviously, within the, certainly, I mean, Washington himself is a former British officer, but, and you know, Montgomery is leading the force from the west, and so the idea is that they're going to meet in this space. And you asked a question a while ago, Kathy, but I mean, the notion here is if we can get Quebec, then we can convince residents in some of the other territories that, yes, you want to be part of this 14th colony, or they wouldn't be calling it that at that point. But, and why not Montreal? I mean, they stop off at Montreal, right? Montgomery does. I think,
Montgomery ultimately takes Montreal, and then they continue on to Quebec. By the time they continue on to Quebec, Montreal is back in British hands because they didn't have enough to leave a force at Montreal to keep it in their hands, so they end up losing it again as they continue on, and then this is just where things really start to go south for them.
Yeah, without getting into the weeds too much here, I mean, there's a lot of important people who are connected. So we mentioned Morgan already, Benedict Arnold. Montgomery is going to get killed here. Arnold's going to get injured. Aaron Burr is involved in this assault on Quebec as well. And ultimately, the biggest problem, I don't know, what would you say, Sam? I mean, it's the issue of well, we cannot besiege the city.
Yep.
So that's problem number one.
Supplies.
We don't have enough supplies. They know we're here.
Fort Ticonderoga during this time is trying desperately to through Philip Schuyler. Schuyler is trying to organize. Schuyler was the commander of Ticonderoga during this time. Schuyler is trying desperately to get supplies, ammunition, artillery to Quebec, but obviously without having Montreal, you can't do that because it's Montreal and then Quebec. The other problem that Schuyler is running into is, as I mentioned before, Ticonderoga is in ruins. So not only is he dealing with a fort in ruins, he's dealing with infighting, he's dealing with contracts expiring, he's dealing with desertion, he's dealing with all of these problems, and nobody wants to assist to go from Ticonderoga to get to Quebec and or Montreal to help out these guys and bring them more ammunition, bring them supplies, bring them what they need. And, you know, this is really the beginning of the downfall of this whole expedition, in my opinion.
Well, the infighting is a really important thing that you reference, because a lot of us, especially as we're entering this 250th anniversary year of the Declaration of Independence, we're not always remembering that we're really talking about 13 separate countries, and ultimately 14, because, of course, Vermont will go its own way and say, you know what? Forget all you people. We're going to be our own independent republic, which they will do from 1777 until 1791, much to the chagrin of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and New York. And it's an interesting moment here because it's not just a rivalry on the military side. You mentioned Arnold, of course. It's not just a jealousy and infighting on that side of it, but it's also the fact that, I mean, the Ethan Allen Arnold conflict partially comes down to, they had two separate orders, as you pointed out, but as they're arriving at Ticonderoga, each is trying to claim the space in the name of their country. Right?
And ultimately, Ethan Allen is the first to send out letters and claims all of the fame for capturing the fort. I believe he only mentions Arnold once. He's like, yeah, that dude helped.
Right.
But other than that, he doesn't say anything. Getting back to Morgan's riflemen as well. Morgan's riflemen and Richard Montgomery's forces, and then whoever else has joined Arnold, the riflemen are against everybody.
Right.
They don't get along with these Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut militias. They're just not getting along. Morgan's riflemen want to do one thing. Arnold wants to do another thing. Montgomery wants to do another thing, and no one can put their heads together and agree on what they need to do.
And another problem, I mean, just again on a practical note for the riflemen, is that assaulting a city, not their skill set.
No.
And it's one of the things that goes into the failure here. They actually do penetrate the gates, and they get inside. The problem is you end up with a dead Montgomery, a wounded, several wounds, but a wounded Arnold, a wounded and captured Morgan, who ultimately gets paroled, and so therefore becomes very important later on in the larger conflict.
What is the name of the painting of Montgomery's death?
Montgomery's
If you could bring up that image by chance of the painting, it should be, I believe it's entitled General Montgomery's Death or something along the lines of that.
Yes.
It's a very famous painting.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
I've
it
seen that.
portrays well
Sort of
what's happened.
Sort of the problems. I mean, you don't have a lot of leadership once, or cohesive leadership, I guess I would say. Once you have some people down, and then you mentioned the supply issue. Even the attack is launched in largely a pretty fierce snowstorm, which presents its own challenges. And after a brief moment of success, it's essentially an all-out failure in which the remaining troops who are able to get out of the city are left to the elements to then reorganize themselves. Now, I will say in the aftermath, so this is all happening basically Christmas Eve into New Year's. And so by the time Knox arrives in the Boston area in late January, as we mentioned, it is apparently literally the same day that they get the news that this has not gone well here in Canada, and then Knox is arriving and saying, hey, the cannon are right out there in Framingham, we're good to go. Washington is able to focus on that and then sort of hope that maybe something can go well. In the spring, I will say Arnold somewhat, what would you say, maybe captures a little bit of the imagination of Americans with his fighting retreat essentially down Lake Champlain.
Yeah.
He's able to do some things that were pretty remarkable and preserve American control in that region of New York and modern-day Vermont.
Yeah, that's where you start really getting into what was known as the Lake Champlain Fleet as well, that is being slowly assembled, not only by the Fort Ticonderoga, but as well as Benedict as well.
Yeah, and so it's like, Arnold's an interesting figure in this regard, in that he's riding highs and lows essentially for much of the early going, as happens in a lot of these spaces. We don't try the invasion of Canada again really until the War of 1812. Spoiler, that didn't go well either.
Canada doesn't apparently want us for anything.
No.
No.
I always think it's amusing because obviously in the 20th century we have a great sort of satire about the invasion of Canada that John Kennedy's involved in, and Alan Alda, I think, is playing the American president in that movie, and it's a very funny kind of commentary in a way on this history. And let's see, in the 1840s, James Polk tries it again up in the Northwest Territory. No, we don't succeed there either.
And
So-
we're going to leave it there, I
Yeah.
think. We've run out of time for this time, and this went really, really fast, gentlemen. So I will speak with you after and find out when you can volunteer. I said volunteer.
Voluntold.
No. come back in and talk to us
Sometimes.
again. Thank you, Peter, very much. Underclass over there, our producer, many thanks to Peter. Thanks to Dr. Nick Ieda from Westfield University, and thank you very much from Sam from our reenactment, and both of them from the Westfield Historical Commission. We'll see you again next month.